very hectic morning, and the Finance Committee is meeting to discuss one of the most significant challenges facing the U.S. economy, and that is the decades-long effort by the Chinese government to manipulate global competition in their favor by any means necessary. The Finance Committee is coming together to respond to this challenge with Democrats and Republicans on the committee working on new legislation that will take concrete steps to boost America's competitiveness and level the playing field for American workers and American businesses. This is a bipartisan effort. Senator Crapo and I have been talking in considerable detail about the core issues of how our country can outcompete China, cracking down on the use of forced labor, fighting censorship, protecting U.S. jobs by rooting out the counterfeiters, shoring up supply chains, including semiconductors and medical products, stepping up trade enforcement and oversight. This is going to be a significant bipartisan push on issues that are front and center for the Senate Finance Committee. I do want to thank Ranking Member Crapo and the many members of the committee on both sides of the aisle who are contributing and have key ideas on these issues. The committee's proposal will be combined with bills from other committees to form a larger package on building up U.S. competitiveness. This is a prospect I think both sides of the aisle can get behind. The trade ripoffs and underhanded tactics of the Chinese government and enterprises have grown at our expense, and they are well known. Massive unfair subsidies destroy any level playing field. Theft of innovative intellectual property, shakedowns of cutting-edge technologies, policies that meddle in supply chains and hurt our consumers and producers, the use of forced labor, absolutely reprehensible on its own, regardless of where it fits into international trade. With the Great Firewall and other sophisticated trade barriers, the Chinese government blocks 10,000 websites and a host of American digital service providers. For the few allowed to enter the China market, the price of admission is censorship. The overall result is untold losses for American companies and their workers. Homegrown Chinese tech giants rip off American innovations and thrive in the absence of American competition. Several of those homegrown firms have outgrown the China market, accessed the U.S. financial system, and invested in American companies. The catch is, this isn't just about economic losses for America. These Chinese firms compete unfairly and also export the government's intolerance of free speech. From solar panels to soybeans to software and everything in between, America's workers, farmers, and our economy writ large have been exposed to China trade cheating for too long. The consequences are visible in Oregon and across the country. Factories have shuttered. Towns have lost their beating economic heart. Fewer and fewer workers believe it'll be easier for their families to get ahead in the future. In short, America has spent 2 decades falling further and further behind in a cold trade war. That didn't change when it turned hot several years ago. The previous administration was right to throw out business as usual on trade with China, but their strategy relied more on what some might call internet muscles and tough talk than serious economic strength. The former president's mean tweets and angry statements didn't get results. The agreements the Chinese government signed mostly rehashed commitments it had already made and broken in the past. Their core trade ripoffs are ongoing. So today, this is about the Finance Committee building a bipartisan coalition to take a different tack. We're pleased to have an opportunity to address these important issues. We've got excellent witnesses. We'll introduce them shortly. But first, let's hear from our friend, Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate those remarks and your spearheading this effort to make America competitive as it can possibly be, particularly with regard to China. I'm glad to be working with you on legislation to strengthen America's trade policies and practices. China is a potent challenge to the United States on several levels: economic, strategic, and moral. Republicans and Democrats can and should work together to formulate a China policy that can effectively confront these challenges. But plainly, there is no need for a Republican or Democrat policy on China, just an American policy. An American policy is precisely that. It reflects the best of America, reflects our competitive spirit, our leadership in innovation, and critically, our values. So how do we put such a policy into practice? Simple. Stay true to what made the American experiment a success. In terms of competitiveness, we should not close off our market or engage in protectionism. China closes off its market and provides distortive subsidies to create national champions. We do not fear competition. We embrace it because America's workers, farmers, and businesses have always confronted challenges head on, and that spirit will never dampen. American companies become global champions because the way forward in a free market is to excel, and America excels like no other in a fair fight. And to fight at its best, America must focus on strengthening its competitiveness, which means we need to be smart in our use of tariffs. We need to cut tariffs on inputs that support American manufacturing or on goods consumed by American consumers, especially the middle and low income families. We can achieve that through programs like the miscellaneous tariff bill and through thoughtful application of the Section 301 tariffs on China. Our open market strengthens America strategically. President Eisenhower told Congress in 1958 that world trade strengthens our friends and increases their desire to be friends. World trade helps to lay the groundwork for peace by making all free nations of the world stronger and more self-reliant. He was right. That is why it is important that we reauthorize the generalized system of preferences program. Developing countries that want to play by the rules should know that the United States will be a reliable trading partner and a fierce friend. For example, there is no question that if most countries are offered a choice between debt trap diplomacy like China's Belt and Road Initiative or the opportunity to have access to the U.S. market, which is governed by the rule of law, they're going to pick America. History is instructive in that regard. In terms of innovation, we should pursue policies that promote and reward creativity, such as strong intellectual property protections. Many of us are rightly repulsed by practices like China's technology theft and its Great Firewall. But the answer is not to construct our own restrictions on data and information or create some social credit score for U.S. companies. The answer, like President Reagan said 3 decades ago, is to tear down the wall. We must directly target those actions that take aim at U.S. companies. We must also negotiate and enforce strong rules through new trade agreements, including at the World Trade Organization. Last, but perhaps most important, are our values. China's human rights abuses are appalling. The communist regime set its tone on human rights at its inception, and it has not improved since. Internationally, we must be sharper in our engagement on human rights by rallying our allies to confront these abuses, including forced labor and the suppression of free speech. What will bring down those abuses is not U.S. disengagement, but facilitating the opportunity for the Chinese people to engage themselves. Domestically, we have to stay true to our processes. That means our approach is shaped by a course that reflects our American tradition of building consensus through dialogue and debate. Whatever anyone may claim China has achieved through its system, ask them if they would rather live in a world that reflects its approach to citizens or ours. Unlike any government official in China, every member present today is here because their constituents chose them through free and fair elections. And each of our members has the right and responsibility to bring their insights into the discussion. This hearing is a part of that discussion, but it's not the end of it. Moreover, it bears emphasis that Congress is democracy at its best, concentrating unfettered power in the executive in China's approach is not ours. Having Congress in the driver's seat on critical trade policy decisions is not a weakness, it's a strength. Chairman Wyden and I still have a lot of work ahead of us to right this ship of state in the world's marketplaces. and I appreciate our partnership in this effort. And we're working together and with members of our committee to achieve that in a legislative package that will strengthen America's competitiveness and benefit its farmers, businesses, and innovators. Thank you for organizing this hearing, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to the testimony from our witnesses.
I thank my colleague, and I think if there is one issue that is central to this country's future, it is being in a position to outcompete China. And I very much appreciate the path that my colleague wants to take. We're going to do this in a bipartisan way. The stakes are enormous, and I thank him for his effort to build the bipartisan coalition. Let's go now to our witnesses. Mike Wessel is here. He's a commissioner of the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission. He has extensive experience. We met first decades ago when he was working on Capitol Hill, focusing on international trade. He now heads a public affairs consulting firm. Then we'll hear from Ann Kokas, an associate professor of media studies at the University of Virginia, a senior faculty fellow at the Miller Center for Public Affairs. She's written extensively about digital trade issues with China, including China's censorship and digital policies and their impact on our country. Next up will be Clete Williams, partner at Aiken Gump, where he advises multinational companies, investors, and trade associations on international economic issues. And he's a former deputy assistant to the president for international economics. And at the White House, he was a trade negotiator. Finally, we'll hear from David Baer, Chief Operating Officer and General Counsel for O'Shaughnessy Holding Company, which owns Element Electronics. Element is an American consumer electronics firm that assembles televisions in South Carolina from primarily imported parts. They announced that they were closing and laying off 126 workers in 2018 as a result of the Section 301 tariffs imposed by the Trump administration. We have an excellent group of panelists. Let's go first to Mr. Wessel.
Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, members of the committee, it's an honor to appear before you today. My name is Michael Wessel, and I am a commissioner on the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission. My testimony today reflects only my personal views. The commission is a somewhat unique bipartisan body. We report to and support Congress. In 7 of the last 10 years, we have issued unanimous reports. Where it was not unanimous, there was only one dissenting vote. Our bipartisanship is a reflection of the broader political support for addressing the challenges posed by the Chinese Communist Party. China is not interested in abiding by international norms. We should stop hoping for change and waiting for it to occur. We need to accept reality and adopt the policies that are in our best interests. We need to make clear that in debating and addressing the challenges posed by the policies of the CCP, we are not disparaging the people of China. Rising anger and aggression targeted at people of Asian descent here in the U.S. or around the globe is unacceptable. The Biden administration is engaged in a top-to-bottom review of past actions, identifying its preferred path forward, and, importantly, what cooperation and coordination with our allies is possible. A multilateral approach is important, but it is not the only approach. For years, we sought multilateral cooperation, but got little help. To paraphrase an old saying, our allies were willing to hold our coat while we bloodied our nose. Our producers and our workers cannot wait for allies to fully appreciate the impact of China's policies and develop the will to act. The outsourcing and offshoring of jobs and productive capacity to China has created unacceptable vulnerabilities. Americans saw that clearly when we were unable to obtain critical PPE supplies as COVID ravaged our country. China has shown its willingness to politicize and indeed weaponize its supplies of vital products. At the end of 2020, U.S. corporations were sitting on more than $5.5 trillion in cash and liquid assets. We need to send stronger signals that we want them to invest those funds here to expand production and create jobs. China's new 14th five-year plan increases support for indigenous innovation and continues an expansive export strategy. Massive overcapacity will continue. Huge subsidies, protectionist and predatory practices, and legal and illegal actions will support their efforts. The CCP is seeking to advance research and development indigenously. The pace of R&D expenditures by U.S. affiliates in China has grown at a faster pace than domestic investments by their U.S. parents. We need to alter that trend. China's leaders are also desperate for foreign capital and investment. Changes in international investment indices may result in $400 billion or more of Western capital flowing into Chinese equities. Bond index changes may spur another $200 billion going into China. Some of our citizens' capital could be invested in companies on the U.S. entities list and DoD's list of companies supporting China's military. There also appear to be investments by U.S. persons in these companies after they were put on these lists. That must stop. We need to treat supply chains as integral components of our national economic security, as well as vital to our critical infrastructure. In the 1980s, America faced competitive challenges from Japan, although they pale in comparison to those posed by China. In 1987, Congress and the administration, the Reagan administration, worked together to create Sematech to reclaim America's momentum in the semiconductor sector. In 1988, Congress passed the Omnibus Foreign Trade and Competitiveness Act to advance America's ability to compete. Now is the time to consider what steps America should take to protect our interests and prepare for the future. Too much of the focus of our China discussions has been about containing, confronting, or decoupling. Many of the actions and policies of the CCP directly challenge U.S. interests. We need to send a strong signal to the CCP, to our companies, to our people, and the world that we will stand up for our interests, we will compete, we will invest, and we will win. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank you, Mr. Wessel, and I like the fact that you closed on the bottom line, which is outcompeting China. Ms. Kokos, welcome.
Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and distinguished members of the Senate Finance Committee, it is an honor to be here. My name is Ann Kokos, and I'm an Associate Professor of Media Studies at the University of Virginia and a Senior Faculty Fellow at the Miller Center for Public Affairs. My testimony reflects my personal views. My remarks today will focus on three key points. First, Chinese laws imperil U.S. tech investment in China and around the world. Second, Chinese firms with close government ties are rapidly acquiring a wide range of U.S.-based digital media and tech sector entities. Third, U.S. firms face pressure to self-censor as a result of U.S. domestic financial pressure paired with Chinese regulations. With the growth of the Chinese market, U.S. national interest and U.S. commercial interests have diverged. The global tech sector is estimated to reach $5 trillion in 2021. The U.S. is poised to make up 33% of that. The Chinese market makes up 14% of the global tech economy, but it also offers a tantalizing market growth opportunity for U.S. firms despite current market entry restrictions. Further, disaggregating the tech economy from other sectors like automotive, agriculture, and healthcare becomes increasingly difficult because of the role that digital management platforms and data integration play in cross-sectoral innovation. However, data security regulation in the United States has historically followed sector-by-sector oversight. Chinese laws imperil U.S. tech sector investment. Unlike the United States, China centralizes tech oversight across sectors to provide a range of tools for the Chinese government to access corporate data and IP, including forced data localization and corporate national security audits. The July 2020 Hong Kong National Security Law permits the Chinese government to hold people and platforms liable for crimes committed extraterritorially, which puts particular pressure on firms that commit perceived transgressions, such as speaking out about Xinjiang human rights, and on those that offer education online at US-based universities. Chinese firms have acquired a wide range of US tech and media firms, enhancing both Chinese military and economic competitiveness. These include social media platform TikTok, gaming platform Fortnite, and many more. Beyond digital entertainment, Chinese firms have acquired companies with US operations in agricultural, health, and manufactured goods sectors and beyond. Further, Chinese firms can also acquire data from U.S. firms through data broker agreements. Such acquisitions limit U.S. economic competitiveness in data-driven industries, where the skills, talent, and data developed in the U.S. advance PRC goals to grow the tech sector, particularly in data-driven AI. U.S. firms face financial pressures to self-censor. Hollywood studios are shifting content as a result of Chinese market access pressures, but they are a canary in the coal mine. Other US-based corporations have shut down the speech of fans and employees to preserve access to the Chinese market, as we have seen in the NBA and on the Hearthstone gaming platform. Delta and Marriott faced economic penalties due to listing Taiwan as an independent entity. H&M stores were delisted from Chinese map platforms for corporate speech about Xinjiang. The list goes on. National security concerns compete with the fiduciary responsibilities of U.S. companies to grow. The U.S. government needs to restructure these incentives. My recommendations are as follows. First, improve U.S. tech sector competitiveness. Increase U.S. government investment in STEM through agencies like DARPA and the Defense Innovation Unit, and through the adoption of acts like the Endless Frontier Act. Building on Mr. Kessel's statement, it's important to work actively against anti-Asian hate in the United States, both in order to advance our mission for equality, but also to welcome researchers and technologists, including through a transparent path to grow their careers here, so that they don't get trained here and then return to China to build their careers. Second, enhance U.S. global and data oversight to prevent data exfiltration to non-allies. Build out a national data privacy framework across sectors to prevent consumer data exfiltration to non-allied countries, and join agreements like the CPTPP, formerly TPP, that already have data governance agreements. Require enhanced reporting on how and when firms share data with third-party providers. Limit the sale of U.S. consumer data through efforts such as the Protecting Americans' Data from Foreign Surveillance Act. Finally, fund Chinese area studies. The lack of secondary and tertiary social science education opportunities to learn about China means that most business people entering the U.S. workforce do not have a working understanding of China's political system, to the detriment of U.S. national security. Thank you for your time and attention. I welcome your questions.
Ms. Kokos, thank you very much for exceptionally important testimony. We very much appreciate your being here. Our next witness will be Clete Williams. Where is Mr. Williams?
I'm here, sir.
Go ahead. Please proceed, Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Senator. Members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The U.S. China competition will define the trajectory of the global economy and our collective security for generations to come. Congress will play a critical role in determining the outcome of this competition. And in my statement today, I offer 6 suggestions to best position the United States for success. First, the United States must run faster with policies that encourage domestic innovation in strategic areas targeted by China, such as artificial intelligence, semiconductors, synthetic biology, 5G and 6G, among others. I understand the concerns raised about overall government spending levels, but misdirected spending in certain areas should not deter us from well-directed spending in areas critical to U.S. innovation leadership, especially if this spending seeks to enhance the strengths of the private sector instead of replace it. More R&D spending, public-private partnerships, and narrowly tailored grant programs are a good idea. Consistent with this, Congress should pass the Endless Frontiers Act, fully fund the USA Telecommunications Act, and CHIPS for America. These policies will help us run faster, but we will not run fast enough if we only focus at home. Much of the revenue our companies use for innovation comes from sales overseas, and the United States needs a proactive trade agenda to open up markets and set standards in emerging technologies. We cannot sit on the sidelines while China implements the RCEP and flirts with the CPTPP. Congress should renew trade promotion authority, encourage the administration to finalize negotiations with the UK and Kenya, and plot a path forward in the Indo-Pacific. If TPP is not viable, we should consider sectoral agreements with TPP countries in areas like digital trade. Second, we must better coordinate with allies, including at the WTO. The WTO's current rules are not adequately constraining China's worst practices. Congress should encourage the administration to make ambitious WTO reform proposals, starting with the trilateral with the EU and Japan. The U.S. must also better coordinate on defensive measures like export controls to maximize their impact and avoid putting U.S. industry at a disadvantage to foreign competitors not subject to such controls. Additionally, it should prioritize the resolution of transatlantic disputes so we can focus our energy on China. Importantly, however, we should not give our allies a free pass. They should be expected to stand up to China alongside the United States and refrain from unilateral discriminatory policies like digital services taxes or the EU's Digital Marketing Act. Third, the United States should engage directly with China for additional market access. Sales to China support American farmers, workers, and businesses, full stop. The Phase 1 deal was a good first step toward a level playing field with largely successful structural provisions on IP, agriculture, and financial services. The United States should now consider how to move on to Phase 2 and obtain structural commitments in other areas. The administration should also reinstate a tariff exclusion process to provide relief for products that cannot be sourced elsewhere and are not core to Made in China 2025. Fourth, the United States must not become China to beat China. We should avoid policies that replicate the very same practices we are condemning, which are inefficient and undermine our credibility to rally an international coalition to our side. More specifically, we should focus supply chain policy on flexibility, redundancy, and partnership with trusted allies instead of trying to make everything at home. Similarly, access to our procurement markets should not be restricted for all foreign actors, but only those who do not provide reciprocal access themselves. We should resist China's approach of invoking national security and trust truly justified and tread carefully when considering novel policies like outbound investment screening. Fifth, the U.S. government should closely align with the private sector on policy implementation, including efforts to eliminate forced labor from supply chains. The U.S. government must also be willing to back U.S. companies facing particularly difficult policies like censorship, which is so embedded in the current Chinese government's philosophy that no company could be expected to navigate it on its own. Finally, we must be clear-eyed about the China challenge and the risk that certain policy choices entail. We should not over-legislate to appear tough, but adopt nuanced policy responses calibrated to the threat posed with clear, achievable objectives. Indeed, if we seek to fully decouple from China and blindly demagogue all Chinese entities and people, including the many that share our concerns about their own government, we could find ourselves on a dangerous path. I believe the policies I've outlined today would provide a better alternative, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Williams. We'll have questions in a moment. Our next witness will be Mr. Baer. Welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee. My name is David Baer, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer and General Counsel of Element Electronics. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share Element's story with the committee. Element is the sole remaining mass producer of televisions in America, and our factory is located in Winnsboro, South Carolina. As Chairman Wyden noted, Element's U.S. factory was on the brink of closure. However, Congress's enactment of the MTB and approval of an exclusion from the 301 tariffs completely reversed the situation and leveled the playing field for Element. As a result, our U.S. factory rapidly grew. At the end of 2020, we were operating all of our 8 production lines and had over 520 team members working in our factory. Importantly, our story is about community and people. At Element, we offer living wages and benefits to our employees, over 90% of whom are African American. I've included in our written submission information about some of our employees and how they've benefited from the ability of Element to offer good paying jobs in our community. However, our success depends on 2 issues that are completely beyond our control: the restoration of an exclusion from the China 301 tariffs and restoration of the miscellaneous tariff bill. The most expensive input in an LCD TV is the glass LCD panel. These panels are not available in the US, thus we must import them. However, we face a severe tariff inversion situation when importing these panels. The normal tariff on LCD panels is 4.5%, while the tariff on the finished TV is 3.9%. Thus, the normal tariff structure incentivizes the importation of finished TVs over producing them in the US. To make matters worse, imports of the same finished TVs from Mexico are duty-free. TV producers in Mexico use the same panels that Element imports and the same factory equipment that Element uses, but Mexican producers import those LCD panels duty-free and then export the finished TVs to the U.S. duty-free. The MTB provided temporary tariff relief to solve this obviously unintentional tariff conflict. But with the lapse of the MTB, we are once again at a severe competitive disadvantage relative to imports, particularly from Mexico. In addition, we face an incremental 7.5% tariff on any LCD panels imported from China as a result of the Section 301 tariffs. We agree that the U.S. must aggressively confront the unfair actions of the Chinese government. However, the U.S. must do so in a way that does not also harm. But that's
There we go.
excluded and expired last September. We were sending non-Chinese sources for LCD panels for a while. Chinese were forced out of the market because of relentless unfair competitive pressure from China. As a result, our factory is again primarily reliant on imports from China. Because of the lapse in both the MTB and the 301 tariff exclusion, we face a combined tariff disadvantage of 12%. Nobody can be expected to pay a premium of 12% for a TV assembled in America. This 12% tariff disadvantage makes our factory in the US uncompetitive, and we're currently operating only 4 production lines, and employment has dropped to 370 team members. Without a restoration of both the MTB and the 301 exclusions, Element will be forced to move production out of the US. This will devastate our workers and our community. Leveling the playing field through retroactively restoring both the MTB and the 301 exclusion will allow Element to successfully compete against anyone. Therefore, on behalf of Element Electronics, our team members, and all their family members, I urge Congress to enact legislation that would retroactively restore the MTB, and if the administration does not retroactively restore the exclusions from the 301 tariffs, then Congress should enact legislation that requires the retroactive restoration of these exclusions. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baer. This has been an exceptional panel of witnesses, and it's hard to know where to start. And I think, Dr. Kokos, a question for you to start, and then we'll go to Mr. Wessel, but we want to hear from all of you in these questions. Doctor, it seems to me what you have done is spelled out how China is using its economic might to export repression. That is essentially what their agenda is all about. Incredible economic might, they're using it to be able to export around the world repression. So start us off by saying, what would be, say, the first 2 steps, the first 2 bold steps you would urge the Finance Committee to take to fight China's repressive digital protectionism?
So there are many steps, but 2 key steps that I would recommend would be to first change how U.S. exchanges fund Chinese entities when they try to enter the U.S., when they try to raise capital in the U.S. So I've written about, for example, the case of iQIYI, which grew from Baidu after Baidu had raised capital on U.S. exchanges, then to become a domestic competitor with Netflix. This is a classic example of how the U.S. actually funds the growth of Chinese firms so that they can become competitive with U.S. firms. The other thing that I think is important along those same lines is to increase reporting requirements for how U.S. firms share their data with China and with Chinese partners, as well as how U.S. firms are investing within the Chinese market. So I think additional reporting requirements there are really important. The other thing is to enhance the use of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act to make more robust the range of different types of items of value that firms could receive from the Chinese government, looking at specifically market access trade-offs.
Points well taken. I'm particularly attracted to this idea of cutting off access to capital because I think that's just a no-brainer. We've got to do that. Thank you, Mr. Wessel. I think Dr. Kokos has really kind of led us into an area where you're really one of the authorities, and I think it would be helpful if you would give the committee some sense of the size and scope of the problem. What is being lost in terms of value, in terms of lost market access, stolen intellectual property rights, and displaced American jobs? What is lost when the Chinese cheat?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for your question. That really goes to the heart of why your committee and others are looking at this issue. It certainly our interest in the rights, the repression, the other issues, the freedom go to the heart of our values, but our workers have been kicked in the teeth because of the China trade relationship. Just a couple of quick comments. The Economic Policy Institute indicated that between the accession of China to the WTO in 2018, 3.7 million jobs were lost. The majority of those jobs were in the manufacturing sector. In 2019, we ran a $134 billion advanced technology products trade deficit. Those are products that we should be excelling in. We do excel in, that are at the core of what you and your colleagues are seeking to advance. But China, through predatory and protectionist policies, has skewed the balance. Finally, the Commission on the Theft of American Intellectual Property, a bipartisan commission, has done great work over the years. Their estimates, using their methodology, last night I computed that between in the last 5 years, there's been $2.4 trillion in U.S. IP that's been stolen. That IP supports American jobs, American innovation, and our future. If we continue to lose at that pace, we will see the decimation of our tech sector, the continued hollowing out of our manufacturing sector, and the loss of our standard of living.
One last question, and we're going to have to be prompt today because we have so many members asking questions. How should the committee strike the balance, Mr. Wessel, between breaking down barriers that keep the Chinese market closed to our goods and services and building up our R&D and domestic capabilities? How would you strike that balance?
Well, I would say it should be an equal balance, but we have to get progress on both. Certainly, as already been talked about, our goal is to be able to sell American competitive products in China based on their competitiveness, not based on what China says they're willing to accept that week or that day. Second of all, because China has been unwilling, and it's evidenced in all their economic programs, we need to invest in ourselves. We need to outcompete China. Americans can do that. As you know, back in the 1980s, President Reagan, along with the Democratic Congress, created Sematech. It was engaged in the Moss talks. We can, if you will, eat and chew gum at the same time. We can't lose sight of doing both at the same time.
Very good. Thank you very much. Next is Senator Crapo, and because it's going to be such a hectic morning, followed by Senator Stabenow, Senator Grassley, and Senator Cantwell. Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'll go to you first, Mr. Baer, and I would like to ask you to be brief in your responses because, as the chairman indicated, we've got a lot of ground to cover here quickly, but I wanted to just highlight the Section 301 tariff exclusion issues that you've so clearly pointed out are so critical to your company, and the MTB reauthorization as two key pieces of what we need to do in this committee right now. You very clearly showed how our failure to reauthorize the 301 tariff exclusions for your company were very damaging and are very damaging. But I just wanted to make a point here. Your company is just one example in America. There are hundreds of 301 tariff exclusions that need to be reinstituted across this country in industries of all different types. Is that not correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
And the failure to be targeted in our imposition of 301 tariffs is critical across our economy. And just the same point, really, with regard to MTB reauthorization. An overwhelming majority of the tariff lines in the MTB are already subject to China Section 301 tariffs. And the MTB provides relief on key inputs that you described for your company with regard to manufacturing. It's critical, again, not just to your company, but across our economy in businesses large and small that need to be able to stay strong and competitive. Is that not correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just for us, right, the combination of the lapsed MTB and the 301 tariff has cost, over 150 jobs in a few months.
No, thank you. And that's just repeated across our economy. It's one of the things that we critically need to do in order to be as competitive and as strong as we can be. Mr. Williams, I'd like to go to you for a couple of questions. America's innovative industries, including its digital technology companies, are the envy of the world. And I'm concerned that China is taking out its envy of U.S. successes by creating new restrictive tools to target these digital companies and other technology-related companies, and that other countries are going to follow in this direction if we don't take some action to stop that. Do you agree? And what can we do about that?
Well, Senator, I absolutely do agree. And I think that the first thing we need to do is stand behind our companies. Digital companies, technology companies in the United States, they are our national champions. And if we're going to win and compete against China, we need to buttress these companies against China's competitors. And I talked in my opening about a bunch of different ways to do it. I think some of the incentives you all are looking at are a great start. But we also need to engage directly with China and push back on them. And I think one thing that really hasn't come into the discussion yet that's important, especially as we're looking at third markets and we're looking at China exporting its policies abroad, is creating international rule sets that we can all collectively enforce against China. To me, that is the way to really push back on that. And I'll finally just add, again, it's not just China. You're also right to be concerned about places like Europe who are looking at various policies that are quite troubling, and we need to stand up there as well.
All right, thank you. And I appreciate your help and input in helping us to identify these actions. Again, for you, Mr. Williams, I'm interested in a point that you made in your written statement. You wrote that we have to remember that the export of non-sensitive items to China allows it to, or its capital essentially, to subsidize U.S. innovation leadership. I agree with that. The restrictions on non-sensitive items are counterproductive because other countries will simply backfill our orders to take our place in China's market. What are some steps that we can do to make sure that our approach is targeted? And how can we ensure that other countries coordinate with us better on trade policy with China to mitigate this backfill issue?
Well, I think an area where this really has come up is in the area of export controls, where the U.S. has taken certain unilateral measures, many of which are justifiable against Chinese companies, but hasn't coordinated them. And so you have the situation where companies can export into China from other markets the very same products that we can't. And so what you really need to do is to coordinate those on a multilateral basis. And if you do that, they're going to be more effective and they're not going to hurt the U.S. in the process. So I would look there. In terms of working with other countries, I think at the end of the day, we need to help them understand that it's in their self-interest and that the same challenges we're facing with China are also affecting their markets. And I think we can get on the same page, push back collectively, and that will be a much more effective approach.
All right, thank you very much.
I thank my colleague. Next is Senator Stabenow. She's got a very hectic morning. Next then would be Senator Grassley. Next then would be Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So appreciate it.
Senator Cantwell.
I so appreciate this panel and witness list. I think they've covered a lot of ground. And as you know, we are working in the Commerce Committee on the major portions of the R&D of the Endless Frontiers Act. So glad to hear that everybody thinks that's a key component of what we should do moving forward. And, you know, I'm so glad to join my two Northwest colleagues, the chairman of the committee and the ranking member. I say that because I think the Northwest does have a very already integrated view of the economies of the Pacific Northwest and Asia. So we already see the complexity of this challenge. That is to say, the 301 tariff exemption expiring causes a great deal of difficulties for a variety of sectors in our economy, a variety of companies. And I think that belies the larger question, which is we already have such an integrated economy. How do we move forward when we absolutely know we want better behavior out of China as it relates to very important broad public policies, whether that's IP theft, privacy issues, a whole myriad of things. So I think, Mr. Williams, your comments, you know, I totally agree with. Flexibility, redundancy, and partnerships. I definitely see that as the opportunity for us to work together. But besides the 301 exemption that my colleague Senator Crapo mentioned, what other tools do we need to affect policy moving forward? And my one concern is that somehow we will go too far and ourselves try to pick winners and losers. And by that I mean the federal government or some enabled aspect of the R&D investment that we're talking about. So supply chains are already complex, they're already integrated. I like the idea of working with our partners, but how do we, what are the cornerstones of those flexibility, redundancy, resiliency, and partnership that we should take forward?
Thank you, Senator. It's a great question, and I'm glad that we are like-minded on many things. You know, I think the point I was really trying to make is that when you're looking at supply chains, you want to be thinking about the positive incentives that you can create to make sure that you can rely upon them in any sort of crisis situation. And some of the things we're looking at in terms of, you know, providing different kinds of funding, R&D, and tax credits to make sure that we have, you know, supply chains that are at least partially sourced in the United States. I'm very comfortable with that. What I've found I think is less effective is the discriminatory aspects of it. Now, in terms of your specific question and how do we better link them with some of these other countries, I think that, you know, looking at creating standards that we all meet. And so if we're talking about, you know, the pharmaceutical sector, or we're talking about the technology sector, you know, what are standards that countries like the U.S. and Japan and the EU and the Korea all adhere to, and that maybe differentiate ourselves from China because we have more of an open model, and those are the kinds of things where we can ensure that there are linkages. I think we can also look at, I think allies should agree together that in crisis situations, we won't put export restraints on each other. And we will have lower tariffs between ourselves so that we can better integrate those supply chains. I do think that part of the conversation has to be an honest look at the fact that once COVID hit and we were in a crisis situation, there were a lot of export restraints imposed around the world. And so if we have allies that we really trust, that we have common standards between each other, I would think that we could try to agree to some of that stuff.
Well, I think that's exactly where we should go. In trade in general, I've been very involved in increasing capacity building, increasing enforcement capabilities at USTR. And I actually think here we just need to bolster our trade strategy as it relates to these policies. On Huawei, I think that's exactly what we should have been doing, running around the globe, getting like-minded countries to say, we're not going to allow technology exports from countries that basically don't adhere to the rule of law of keeping a government backdoor out of technology solutions. Why would we let any government have a backdoor to technology solutions, let alone one as big as the Chinese market? So I just think we didn't rally enough of our international allies soon enough on that. So what do we have to build here in the United States to give us capacity? I mean, if that's 20 more people at the State Department, count me in, because 95% of consumers live outside of the United States. So we have to be building the capacity to have these conversations on an international basis so that we can go to China with a full panoply of markets, not just the US market, but a panoply of other markets, saying this is what it's going to take to do business. And the sooner we get at those longstanding US principles that we know that a lot of our allies agree on, I think the sooner we'll really have the kind of market power that we want to have with China in implementing new policies. I agree. I'm not being naive, but at the same time, the Northwest does look at them as a market. So we're not going to just X them out either. So I think that this is a better strategy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague who is so knowledgeable about these issues, and we definitely look forward to partnering closely with you, and I thank her. Next will be Senator Cornyn. Oh, Senator Grassley is here. Senator Grassley, please proceed. We called you earlier. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. A very important and needed hearing that you're sponsoring. Thank you. I want to talk about counterfeit goods from China and Hong Kong. And that's increased considerably in recent years. And so my questions leading up to asking Mr. Wessel, as Americans turned to e-commerce, criminals took advantage of innocent consumers greater than they did before e-commerce. I introduced legislation last week to give the U.S. Customs and Border Protection more authority to share information with rights holders on suspected counterfeit products. This bill would allow the CBP to share information with its private sector partners, creating a much stronger network for counterfeit detection. In addition to, so now to my question, in addition to information sharing between public and private, how can Congress prevent the trade of counterfeit products through trade policy? And how can information sharing across the public and private sector benefit and secure U.S. trade?
Thank you for your question, Mr. Grassley, and thank you for your leadership on so many of these issues, Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act, and many others. Your question is spot on, because it's not just the economic losses that come from counterfeit products, but it's the real potential harm to American health and safety from many of those products. Your legislation is an important anchor for that approach. It needs to be supplemented by providing CBP the resources to be able to support that policy, because, as you know, they often focus on the interdiction of other products and concerns. And finally, we just need a all of the above strategy to make our various e-commerce platforms, attorneys general and others aware of the problem and coordinated in their response.
Now to Mr. Williams. According to USDA data, total exports of agriculture-related products covered under China Phase 1 agreement reached approximately $27 billion in 2020. That means the export target of $33 billion was missed by $6 billion. Despite the missed target, 2020 was a record for exports of agricultural products covered by the agreement. As one of the negotiators on Phase 1 deal with China, I appreciate hearing your perspective on the deal. Recognizing the challenges of the global pandemic, do you believe China is living up to its commitments in Phase 1? And what steps, including structural reform, should the Biden administration make sure China takes before they move to Phase 2?
Thank you, Senator. It's a great question, and I agree with the point that you made, which is that we are seeing record numbers of agricultural exports to China, and I believe that the reason for that is the Phase 1 deal. And I would emphasize, I know that there's a lot of attention often paid to the purchasing chapter and the targets that set. I think it's much less important than the structural commitments themselves. And if you look at agriculture, the reason that we are seeing record numbers is because there were 57 underlying structural commitments that China made to actually change its laws and regulations to allow in chicken, beef, and pork for the first time in years by changing their actual underlying laws and regulations. And that's juxtaposed against energy, services, and manufacturing, where we didn't have the underlying chapter, and therefore we weren't anywhere close to our purchasing commitments. And so I think what that shows you is the importance of the structural chapter. And I would say in agriculture, China's doing a good job. On IP, you can look at the national trade estimate that USTR just put out. I think it's probably a B. You know, they've done a lot of what they said. There's a couple things that are in progress and that are incomplete. There is additional financial services access, so that's been good. So I think more or less they've done what they said they were going to do. Obviously, there's areas where they haven't fully followed through, and we need to put pressure them there. You know, moving on, what I would do is I'd look for additional structural commitments. I wouldn't focus as much on the purchases moving forward. And where I'd start is with some of the text that got scuttled in May 2019. As you all may remember, we were very close to what was going to be a somewhat more comprehensive deal with China. Talks broke down for a variety of reasons, and we only got about half of what we were negotiating, and there was stuff we left on the table on services, on non-tariff barriers, and additional things on forced technology transfer. I think I would pivot there next, and then work with the allies and some of the more structural things like SOEs and industrial subsidies.
Thank you. My time's up.
I thank my colleague. Senator Cornyn is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Senator Crapo for working together on the bipartisan negotiations on the Confront and Compete Against China legislation, including items that are particularly important to me: censorship by foreign governments, especially in digital trade, which follows up on my work last year as chairman of the Trade Subcommittee working with Senator Casey; reasserting congressional authority over trade negotiations through additional oversight; the possible creation of a temporary restraining order or national security exclusion order on the importation of goods obtained through trade secret theft by foreign governments and state-owned enterprises; identification of unacceptable risks to our supply chains and outgoing investment to unreliable foreign adversaries in event of an emergency or national security; and finally, reauthorization of the Generalized System of Preferences and Miscellaneous Tariff Bill and other tariff relief. And finally, I'd like to note that while the United States may not need an industrial policy per se, it's clear that the entirety of the Chinese government, from its military to its blog posts, they have one that they're using against us. So Mr. Williams, let me ask you a question, if I may, please. You testified last year before the Trade Subcommittee, Senator Casey and I led that effort, on how foreign governments like China and Russia use censorship to block market access and cost companies billions of dollars, especially in the digital trade space. I'm grateful that the current package currently being negotiated by the chairman and ranking member includes addressing foreign censorship as a key objective at my request. I simply don't think we can tolerate American citizens being censored by foreign governments on our own soil. So let me ask you, if I may, please, can you tell me your thoughts on how we can better address this problem, addressing censorship in the trade space?
Certainly, Senator, and thank you for your leadership on so many of these issues. I agree with all the priorities that you highlighted. On censorship in particular, this is a very tricky issue. And it is something that is appalling, but it's very difficult for our companies on their own to push back in this policy that is so deeply embedded in this Chinese government's philosophy. And some of the ideas I believe that you're considering that would have a government role, where the government steps in and shields U.S. companies, I think that's the right approach. I know there was some talk of putting in place a special 301 or a mechanism like that at USTR to focus on this, where then the U.S. government would come in, they'd investigate it and come in and potentially try to push back against it. I think those are the right way to go. I think it's challenging, again, for an individual company to push back on this because of just the mass power of the Chinese government.
Ms. Kokos, can you discuss how the Chinese government's censorship policies factor into the planning and investments of American businesses?
Policy responses to this. One thing that's really important is to enhance financial reporting of the types of investments that we see by Chinese firms within the U.S. So I'm looking specifically at firms like Alibaba Pictures or Tencent Pictures, which produce films within the U.S. market and are heavily funded by Chinese investments. So I think enhancing financial reporting, particularly in content-producing industries, is very important. One of the other challenges that we face is that this is a huge challenge for privately held corporations. So it's very difficult to understand how much Chinese investment and how much Chinese influence is occurring within privately held media and tech companies. So I think that one thing that could be interesting would be to look at special reporting for privately held companies about their level of Chinese investment and their level of data transfer. Finally, something that's important to protect U.S. companies is data privacy regulations at the national level. And this is important because it will help protect the data of U.S. companies from being transferred to China. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been exploring the creation of an authority that would place in essence a temporary restraining order or a national security exclusion order under Section 337 of the Tariff Act of 1930 that would help block the importation of goods created through trade secret theft by foreign governments or state-owned enterprises. Mr. Wessel, could you discuss briefly the Commission's work, the International Trade Commission's work on confronting intellectual property theft, and whether you think this concept might be useful?
Thank you for your question, Senator Cornyn. I think it's vital. We've seen that the utility of Section 337 is somewhat limited in terms of the ability to respond quickly, the burden of bringing a suit, the discovery, and all the other issues that go along with it. So some kind of blanket approach that allows companies to earn their way out of it by proving that they did not engage rather than having to prove, which is difficult, their violations, I think has value and something that the ITC and Congress should seriously consider.
Well, right now it seems like China steals intellectual property with near impunity, and I'd like to see another tool available to the U.S. government. Mr. Williams, finally, can you share your experiences with IP theft by China and how you would view this new tool?
Mr. Williams, briefly, I think Senator Cornyn's making some very important points. We just have 20-some senators to go, so please respond to Senator Cornyn's question, and then we can move on.
I beg your pardon, Mr. Chairman. I didn't have a clock in front of me, so this is my last question.
Understand. Important points you're raising.
I think it's a good idea to explore along with your other ideas, and we can follow up on that in greater depth.
Very good. Look forward to working with my colleague on this. Senator Menendez.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yesterday, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which I chair, voted out on a bipartisan fashion, the Strategic Competition Act 21-1, and it's rare around here these days. It's the first major proposal to bring Democrats and Republicans together in laying out a strategic approach towards Beijing. The bill ensures that the U.S. is positioned to compete with China across all dimensions of national and international power for decades to come. And I think our government has to be clear-eyed and sober about Beijing's intentions and actions and calibrate our policies and strategy accordingly. So I look forward to the bill now coming to the floor. And Mr. Wessel, in your capacity, I don't know if you had a chance to get a sense of the legislation as a commissioner on the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission. What do you think about what we did in the bill? What would you like to see that we didn't do? How can we make it better? Those are some of the questions I have for you.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate the question and appreciate your leadership and work on this issue for so long. I'll be honest, I was unable to track all the amendments, but the underlying issues in the committee reported discussion of it, I think, has indicates a very strong base that deserves support. One of the critical areas I think you addressed is influence operations. And going to the previous question, that really underlies a lot of the impact on our companies, our workers, our researchers. We found academic researchers stifling their own or censoring their own discussions, journalists being forced to censor their own discussions, and the impact of these influence operations through the United Front Work Department, Confucius Institutes, and other operations, I think has had a pernicious impact. Your requirement that universities report contributions over $1 million to determine what impact they may have on free speech, research, etc., I think is a critical component along with many of the other provisions that the committee adopted yesterday.
Well, thank you. We look forward to you having a chance to review the totality and any insights we welcome. Would you say that that trade is obviously one of our challenges with China, but isn't it much bigger than trade?
It's much bigger than trade. Again, it goes to the entire operation of markets, free speech, overall competitive equation in terms of what's happening to our own workers here, for example. Just the threat of offshoring or outsourcing has limited wage gains, has resulted in companies deciding on certain investment postures. And so it has had an overall negative effect. And as you well know, in Africa and many other places, what's been happening through the Belt and Road Initiative, through debt diplomacy, and other Chinese CCP actions has corroded international norms.
So it's fair to say that making investments here at home, as China has made in their country, is critically important in order to not only confront China, but to compete with China.
I think it's vital. You know, I go back to President Reagan, who was known as being a free market advocate, who supported Semitech and other investments in U.S. It's not choosing winners and losers in the overall sense. It's choosing to make America the winner in this process.
Well, let me just finally, when the U.S. entered into the Phase 1 agreement with the Chinese government on trade and investment issues, China agreed to purchase $100 billion in U.S. manufacturing, agriculture, services, energy exports per year for 2 years following the agreement. We're now a year into this agreement, and Congress and the general public have no idea whether China is meeting the terms of the Phase 1 agreement. $100 billion for U.S. manufacturing and agriculture isn't exactly chump change that we can afford to ignore. Is there currently any way for Congress to know whether China is following the terms of Phase 1? Should we be putting our trust that China is complying with Phase 1? Because I don't know that I would personally do that.
I certainly wouldn't. Again, I'm a Democrat, but I use the Reagan line, trust but verify. I think USTR, Department of Commerce, and others have the ability to track on a very granular basis what we're selling. But I also think it's important to recognize that we should allow competitiveness to choose what China buys, not simply what they choose. So, for example, Senator Grassley asked about Phase 1. I'd like to see China open its market to crushed soybean, not just the underlying product. I want to see value-added products, the best we have to offer getting in there, not just the products that they want to buy as a commodity level that often become industrial tourists, products that they transform into products that come right back into our market.
Yeah, well, I'll close, Mr. Chairman, just saying I'd like to know, have they complied? And this is one of the reasons I think that our efforts to have an IG at USTR is so important. We'd have greater insights at the end of the day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Menendez, and I want to know that information as well, so we'll be working closely with you. Our next two panel members will be Senator Thune and then Senator Carper. Yes, both of them are here. Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this important hearing. And let me just say to begin with that the China that joined the World Trade Organization in 2001 is a very different country than it is today. China is now the world's second largest economy and a strategic competitor of ours across multiple fields, particularly in key areas. If you look at, for example, 5G, advanced technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, China is a military power in the Asia Pacific and has undertaken arguably the world's largest infrastructure program, the Belt and Road Initiative, across all corners of the globe. Yet at the World Trade Organization, China continues to self-designate as a developing country, just as they did in 2001, in order to justify lower levels of trade commitments. Self-designating as a developing country not only provides China with trade advantages vis-a-vis the U.S. and other countries, but it undermines the institution of the WTO. Mr. Williams, is it economically justifiable for China to continue to self-designate as a developing country at the WTO? And what steps should the United States take to accelerate WTO reforms, and what would some of those reforms look like?
Thank you, Senator. And I agree very strongly that it doesn't make any sense for China to be classified as a developing country. What developing country does in the WTO system is it generally allows you to get away with lower levels of commitments in ongoing negotiations. And it just doesn't make sense for the second largest economy in the world to say we're not going to take on commensurate commitments with the United States. What the United States tried to do under the Trump administration that I think was a good idea was put in place objective criteria which would graduate if you met that criteria. That includes things like being a member of the OECD, having a significant proportion of global trade, being a member of the G20, and if you apply those criteria to China, they would graduate. I think, what we need to do here is we need to encourage other countries to self-graduate. Korea is one that showed some leadership here and said, you know what, we're not going to call ourselves a developing country anymore. And I think we need to push other countries to do that, and then also push for more objective criteria over time. In terms of a broader WTO proposal, this is an area where the U.S. has been forward-leaning. We need to get proposals in there that deal with some of China's worst practices. The trilateral with the EU and Japan, it's a great idea, but it needs to get to an outcome that we can just put into the WTO. So we really need to prioritize that. And I do think the U.S. should engage on dispute settlement reform, which is an area they didn't engage quite as much on when I was part of the Trump administration. It doesn't mean give up the changes we need to see, but let's go out there with some proactive proposals and see what we can do. And so I think there's a lot of different ways we can do that. I'd encourage this administration.
15 countries, including China, signed a major trade deal last November. The deal, called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, forms the world's largest trading bloc and covers about a third of the global GDP. With RCEP now a reality and America not a party to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, what should be the top trading priority, I should say, for the United States to compete and lead in the Asia Pacific? And Mr. Williams, you want to start with that? Anybody else who wants to comment on that?
Yeah, I do, and enthusiastically indeed. I'll jump in here and say, look, we need to get in the game in the Indo-Pacific. I understand that senators and others, including the former president, may have had problems with TPP, but the answer to me wasn't to walk away. The answer was to renegotiate those aspects of it that we didn't think were sufficient. That's exactly what we did with USMCA in a strong bipartisan consensus. And I think that was great. Let's do it with TPP. But again, if that isn't viable for some reason, let's at least look at building block agreements with countries in that region. I think digital trade is an area where we can start. There's a lot of like-mindedness. Start with building blocks in key sectors and then try to build it over time. So again, ideal for me would be the comprehensive TPP renegotiated. If we can't do that for whatever reason, we start with building blocks in TPP countries.
Do we need to renew TPA?
I would, Senator. I think it would be a good idea to have that authority because it gives us credibility at the negotiating table, and it also makes sure that Congress has a direct say in what the administration is doing.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time's expired. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Thune. We'll be working closely with you. Senator Carper and Senator Portman are next. Senator Carper.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to all of our witnesses. I want to follow up on Senator Thune's line of questioning and focus on TPP. I think one of the best ways we could have moved forward in terms of trade in the last decade was the TPP, and the idea that we pulled out of it. We pulled out of a trading bloc that included us, 11 or 12 other nations, 40% of the world's trading, and we walked away from it. China was on the outside, kept out on the outside because of their bad behavior on trade issues, and we walked away for it. I think when I think of some of the dumbest things that we've done in recent years in terms of trade, that's definitely high on the list. I just wanted, if each of you could, if you haven't already spoken, Ms. Williams already spoke, but could each of you take just a few minutes to share your thoughts on the benefits of taking a multilateral approach to trade to remain competitive with China? And my second follow-up question to that would be, in your view, is there a possibility that negotiations can somehow resume and put Humpty Dumpty back together again with respect to TPP?
Thank you, Senator Carper. Let me start quickly. First of all, as I said in my testimony, multilateral approaches are key. That is what we should be seeking, but at the same time, we can't wait for our multilateral partners to wake up to the real challenge that China's economic and other activities poses to them and their people. We have to act for our own. As to the TPP, let me, as my testimony also indicated, I chair the staff chair of the Labor Advisory Committee. When President Obama looked at the TPP early on, I was one of those brought into the Situation Room to have a deep discussion about what the architecture was going to be. And I think many of us thought that engaging in that way could be helpful. The ultimate agreement, though, which would have allowed 37% of a vehicle to qualify under the rules of origin, that would have allowed Vietnam, for example, to comply with labor law requirements by having a 5-cent minimum wage and suffice, and that would suffice.
Ms. Wessel,
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to hold it right there. Let's go to our other witnesses. Thanks so much. Same
Thank
question.
you so much. Thank you so much, Senator Carper. This is a really important question, and I think, as I said in my remarks, I think it is important to rejoin the CPTPP, what it is as it is now. One thing that I would like to highlight: the challenge of multi-stakeholder agreements or of multilateral agreements doesn't move us forward as quickly as we could. Through my research, one of the things that I've identified is that there are multi-stakeholder tech standards organizations like the IETF or the HCSM that have the capacity to build out tech standards and don't require the same level of overall coordination as a multilateral organization. Now, the U.S. government has held back from funding participation in these organizations. However, that is not the case with the Chinese government. And I realize we don't want to out China. However, it is important to have a voice at the table for these crucial standards making bodies. Thank you.
Mr. Williams, you've already spoken a little bit on this. I'm going to ask you to respond more fully and directly to my questions, if you would. Please.
Sure. Sure. I thought what Mr. Wessel said was right on money. I do think the rules of origin for automobiles and the TPP agreements might have been a tad too permissive. That is an area that I might look at as I were to try to renegotiate it. And there are other areas that you could also look at. I mean, the reality is TPP now, unfortunately, was I think the negotiations were more or less concluded in 2012 or 2013. So it's a little bit outdated, and we've improved things through the USMCA. So I think you would want to do more or less a side by side in certain areas and figure out where can we benefit from your collective bipartisan wisdom and the updates that you helped the past administration make on USMCA and apply those to TPP. Now, we may not want to do everything. It's a different set of countries, but I do think all those rules of origin updates are somewhere to look. And maybe you don't go quite as far because you're not the North American market, but probably beyond where you were before. And if you can pin that down, then I think you could try to update some of the other areas and get an agreement that the U.S. can return to.
Thanks so much. Mr. Chairman, I suspect I'm out of time. Could I just flag for a question for the record with respect to Section 301 tariff exclusion process?
Absolutely.
Ask the witnesses for the record, what should Congress do to reform this process in order to provide greater certainty and predictability for American companies? Thanks very much.
Senator Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank to you and Senator Crapo for holding this hearing. One, because it's important to talk about our challenges with China, but most importantly, because you're developing a package to look at how we, in fact, do what you said at the outset, which is, and I'm quoting, take concrete steps to level the playing field for American workers. I couldn't agree with you more, and I think we have an opportunity here with this broader legislation that's moving to have the Finance Committee be involved in that. So one such proposal, as you know, Senator Brown and I introduced recently, which is to update our anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws. And it's really an attempt to help with regard to the real world out there as to how China is evading the existing laws, which were strengthened in what's called level the playing field law. This is our Level the Playing Field Act 2.0. And it looks at these issues that I think every single one of us have had to address. Certainly know about steel, where 15 years ago, China had about 18% of the steel production in the world. Now they have about half of it, and they're dumping it in various places, and sometimes third parties and third countries that send it to the United States and therefore avoid our anti-dumping or countervailing duty laws. Sectors like chemicals, shipbuilding, cement, paper, glass, aluminum, all face the same overcapacity issue. And whether it's polyester, textured yarn from North Carolina, or lawnmowers from Nebraska, or metal file folders from Delaware, or woven ribbons from Maryland, or xanthan gum from Oklahoma, or woven sacks from Louisiana, every member of this committee has been facing this in one way or the other. So our legislation would make it easier for manufacturers to win cases when China moves its factories to new countries in order to escape the application of U.S. trade remedies, and would give the Commerce Department new tools to go after China's Belt and Road Initiative by accounting for trade distorting subsidies given by China to producers in other countries. So, Mr. Wessel and Mr. Williams, I hope you are familiar with our legislation. We sent it to you for your analysis, and we got some input from you. Do you both agree that this committee should consider this Level the Playing Field 2.0 legislation to update our existing trade remedy laws to better address the reality, which is the global nature of China's non-market behavior?
Thank you, Mr. Senator Portman. Thank you for Level the Playing Field Act 1.0 and 2.0. I think your legislation, along with Senator Brown, is critical, especially as we face the recovery out of the pandemic. One of the critical provisions in the bill is to look at profitability in a different way. We have companies that were shut down during the pandemic, and now that they're restarting, if they start earning a small profit, that could be used against them as they try and fight massive subsidized and dumped products by the Chinese, who, as you know, have overcapacity in solar and aluminum and steel and countless other industries. The provisions in yours and Senator Brown's bill, are the tool chest that America needs to compete.
Thank you, Mr. Williams.
Yes, Senator, appreciate your leadership on this issue, and conceptually, I definitely agree with what you're trying to do. And I do think that we need to find a way, so we're not constantly playing whack-a-mole as China uses subsidies and moves production to avoid our duties. And if you look at third country subsidization and third country dumping, those are areas the European Union has also been focused on. So I think it's a great opportunity for a joint proposal there. I'd have to come back to you. I haven't had a chance to noodle on every specific of your new legislation. So I would get back to you on that, but I love the idea overall. I would also say, as I alluded to in earlier remarks, we got to do a better job on this stuff at the WTO. and I would look to try to do rules there. And then I'd look to try to figure out a way to reverse some past decisions that have undermined our ability to counteract Chinese subsidies. The public bodies decision, as we call it, which hurt our ability to use countervailing duties against state-owned enterprises, was wrongly decided, and I think we need to figure out a way to fix that.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. Next is Senator Cardin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and let me thank all of our panelists. The U.S. China trade issue is one of the most important issues that we have to get right. It is very challenging when we look at the fact that we are promoting market economies and China wants to dominate through government-controlled economies. When we want to protect intellectual property and China wants to take intellectual property and use it for their own advantage, and that we want to promote trade with other countries so that both economies, all economies, can do better, where China is using their trade leverage in an effort to promote their rules in regards to market control, government-controlled economies. So we have challenges. In 2015, I was responsible for including in the Trade Promotional Authority as a principal negotiating objective good governance and anti-corruption. Now, obviously, we're not in the position to enter into a trade agreement with China that would be, I think, strong on these governments' issue. But my question, I'll start, I think, with Mr. Wessel. My question is, do we have adequate trade remedies and tools today to deal with the corruption and anti-competitive nature of our relationship with China? Or do we need stronger tools in order to put us on a level playing field as it relates to governance issues and anti-corruption issues?
Thank you for your question, Senator, and your leadership 2015 and beyond. I think that the short answer is we need new authorities, we need new tools, and we need new enforcement measures. There are some on the books that could be better enforced, but when it comes to good governance, corruption, which goes to the heart of many of the degrading policies around the globe, I think a lot more can be done and should be done by Congress.
Well, I hope you would be, and all the panelists would be free in giving us suggestions as to how we can, what we should be considering as we take up our relationship with China. I know we have our traditional trade remedies, but it seems to me they were not created to deal with the circumstances of good governance and corruption. So it'd be helpful if you could help us fine-tune our tools or new tools in order to deal with the challenges we have with China. Look, I'm for competition, but it's got to be on a level playing field, and today it's not on a level playing field. Mr. Wessel, I want to raise one additional issue as it relates to China, as to how we use trade. China's activities in the China Seas is anything but in our national security interests as they try to dominate the South China Seas. That obviously affects the free flow of commerce and presents national security threats, but it also affects trade directly. So what should we be considering in our trade relations with our allies and partners and with China to deal with influencing China's nefarious activities in the China Seas?
Well, Senator, thank you. I don't know that there are any easy answers to that question. We've been trying, as you know, for quite some time. China's decision to ignore UNCLOS decision on the 9-dash line and other activities, their reef and rock rebuilding activities, as well as the use of fishing boats as sort of a civilian militia around many of these islands, and what they did with Vietnam in terms of their oil rig. I think it's pernicious, it is corrosive, and it's continuous. And I think we need to engage in a much deeper relationship with our partners there and have a coordinated strategy to address the trade and other impacts that we see.
Well, I'll invite again all the panelists to give us suggestions in this regard, because I want you to know, Senator Menendez mentioned the fact that we passed by an overwhelming majority in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee a major bill as it relates to China. One of the amendments that we could not consider, but would have passed overwhelmingly, was Senator Rubio's amendment that I was a co-sponsor of, that would have dealt with the taking action against China because of their activities on the China Sea through the use of sanction type activities. We'll use that. Sometimes that's a blunt instrument. It would be better if we had a more fine-tuned way of dealing with China's activities in the China Sea. So I welcome your thoughts. Otherwise, I think Congress will look for a more direct way to respond to China's activities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cardin. Next is Senator Toomey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My first question is for Mr. Williams. The United States currently has 25% tariffs on steel imports and 10% tariffs on aluminum imports for most countries, including many close allies of the United States. As you know, they were authorized by the Trump administration under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. In my view, this has alienated to some degree our allies who correctly view these tariffs as an unwarranted move to protect a domestic industry, not a national security issue. So my question for you is do you agree with the view that the imposition of these steel and aluminum tariffs under Section 232 has undermined our country's ability to work with our allies in confronting China's many objectionable practices?
Thank you, Senator. I have not been a strong proponent of the 232 action that President Trump took. I was very involved in the interagency process where we considered how to move forward. I agreed with the president that there was a very serious concern with Chinese excess capacity and that it was distorting global markets. But my view was that it was hurting Europe, it was hurting Japan, and it was hurting our allies around the world just like it was hurting us.
Right.
And so I would have preferred a concerted solution where we all work together to isolate the bad practices coming out of China.
Right.
I think that would be a better approach.
Thank you. So, Mr. Chairman, I mean, I don't think there's any question that the 232 tariffs weakened our ability to work with allies to confront China. I would also argue that 232 steel and aluminum tariffs have been harmful to the U.S. economy by any objective measure. They've cost us a lot of manufacturing jobs, maybe as many as 75,000. They've increased steel and aluminum prices and made U.S. exports less competitive. I would argue it's a misuse of executive authority. Remember, the Department of Defense determined that steel and aluminum tariffs were not necessary to meet defense requirements. Nevertheless, the Commerce Department decided to recommend the use of Section 232 to target imports that don't threaten national security. These tariffs have not accomplished any of the stated goals. They've done nothing to decrease steel overcapacity. They've had an absolutely minimum impact on steel imports from China. And worst of all, Mr. Chairman, and this is why I'm bringing this up, there's nothing we in Congress can do about it. Now, the Biden administration's in the process of reviewing, and I'm hoping that they will recognize the domestic economic damage and the global implications, and they'll make the right decisions and lift these tariffs. But the fact is, Congress has no choice but to sit on our hands and passively wait on the administration to make a decision in an area, that is to say, collecting taxes and duties, that the Constitution delegates explicitly to us. And that's why I think we need to reform the underlying statute to reassert the responsibility that we have in this area. If removing these tariffs is an important part of working with our allies, and working with our allies is important in combating China, then it should be the prerogative of this committee to reform what I think is the excessive delegation of authority. And we should do it in any legislation this committee considers when dealing with China. So as you know, Mr. Chairman, I introduced a bill last year with Senator Warner. We had over 60 groups across a wide range of diverse industries. We had a number of Democrats and Republicans who co-sponsored the legislation on the committee and off the committee. And the premise is simple. It just restores responsibility over tariffs, which is to say taxes, to Congress, where the Constitution actually puts it. It does not take away the ability of the president to use Section 232 for legitimate national security purposes. It just requires that Congress authorize that. Colleagues, Congress is, after all, the first branch of government, and we have explicit constitutional responsibilities, and they include trade. I think we should act that way. So I've introduced this legislation when there was a Republican in the White House. I continue to support it when there's a Democrat in the White House, because for me, this isn't about party politics. Irrespective of who the president is, I think Congress should accept this responsibility. We can take an important step in that direction, Mr. Chairman, by including Section 232 reform in the upcoming China bill, and I hope we will do exactly that. Thank you.
I thank my colleague. As he and I have talked about before, there's no question in my mind that Donald Trump misused the tariff concept. What we're waiting to see is how President Biden is going to look at it, and I'm very hopeful that we'll see a fresh approach. Next is Senator Brown. And I don't see the senator. The next would be Senator Cassidy.
Hey, hello, everybody. Commissioner, I'm very interested in trade-based money laundering, if you will, the partnering, if you will, or coupling the money laundering of illicit dollars with licit trade. And a way that billions, tens of billions of dollars are moved out of the United States annually. Any sense of the magnitude by which this may be occurring with trade with China?
I apologize, Senator. I do not know. I can tell you, though, briefly that last week the China Commission held a hearing where we looked at China's aggressive expansion on digital currency, and that has serious repercussions for money laundering, lowering the ability or reducing the ability of our sanctions regimes to work. But as to money laundering directly, I'll have to get back to you after talking to our committee staff.
Sounds great. Mr. Williams, I really liked your testimony because on the one hand, you know, I've been bouncing between committee hearings. I apologize for everybody, but I think you mentioned the need to strike a balance. You cannot be antagonistic, nor can you be a folding chair. There has to be some sort of pushback. At the same time, there has to be continued engagement. So, and you gave some particulars there. So let me just kind of specifically mention that. Again, I have this interest in international money laundering. And it does occur to me, though, that that requires the cooperation of both countries. You have to have transparency into banking transactions. The commissioner just mentioned the potential for this cryptocurrency to facilitate transactions for which inherently they're crypto. Do you have any kind of practical suggestions of how we could engage the Chinese government to cooperate with us on money laundering, which, by the way, may be part of their capital flight, which I gather capital flight's a major issue. So I do think there's a vested interest. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I certainly agree with your overall concept, and as reflected by my statement that engagement needs to be part of our answer. I haven't spent a ton of time on money laundering issues, so I'm afraid I don't have a sophisticated answer for you, but I do think that finding a way to work together through some of the international institutions, you know, I know there was an initiative through the G20 that I was just tangentially involved with. Those kind of things make sense to me. We have to find ways to partner because even as we're pushing back, there are mutual problems and try to solve them together is in our interest.
So I'm not sure who this question is directed towards, but the thought has occurred to me. The labor standards and the environmental standards in China are either non-existent or not enforced. Indeed, you could call it a negative enforcement if you include slave labor. And on the other hand, we have treaties with Mexico and the CAFTA-DR that require labor and environmental standards. Now, in a sense, this turns out to be a subsidy to China, allowing them to undercut the cost of production within one of these other countries because they do not have to comply. And the cost of compliance inherently adds cost. Now, one, do you agree with that observation? And I open that up to anyone who feels qualified to speak. And secondly, what do we do about that? Because otherwise there'll be a giant sucking sound of business from Central America to China. And when that occurs, people lose jobs and they tend to migrate to the United States.
Senator, I can jump in quickly and just say, I mean, it's something I have written about a little bit in the past, and I put forward a WTO reform proposal, and one of the ideas there was to try to impart those kinds of standards into the international rule set so that they do apply to China just as they apply to countries with which we have an FTA. Because I agree with you, China shouldn't have a leg up on our closest allies and partners through FTAs.
Senator, yes, I agree with your comment 1,000%. The AFL-CIO, I believe in 2004, had filed a 301 petition regarding China's labor rights violations. The petition was not accepted. I think that needs to be updated because I think since that time, we've all seen what China's failure to promote labor rights, freedom, et cetera, has all had on our own workers. So I would suggest that we update that petition and bring it forward, as we also look at doing what Clete is saying about bringing this into the WTO. But until the WTO acts, we can't afford to allow continued impact on our own people.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cassidy. Next is Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see all of you on the panel. And Mr. Wessel, good to see you again. Would you agree, Mr. Wessel, that China's never engaged in a good faith effort to reduce overcapacity?
I would agree 100%. Yes, sir.
So Senator Portman and I have recently introduced legislation, I think you know, to strengthen our anti-dumping and countervailing duty, building on the Level the Playing Field Act of 5 years ago to challenge China's unfair trade practices and reduce the impact of overcapacity and support workers in Ohio and Oregon and Senator Casey's Pennsylvania and all. Do you agree this legislation will help support Ohio steel workers and protect U.S. jobs?
Senator, I think it's not only Ohio steel workers, but workers all across the country. Because as you know, it's steel, it's aluminums, it's chemicals, it's solar up in Senator Wyden's area. It's about 15 to 17 sectors that are in overcapacity and that decimate U.S. Production and employment. So I think the tools you're talking about are vital and they reflect a changing nature of China's competition.
So walk through for the committee why the Brown-Portman bill will level the play, will help to create more of a level playing field across those 17 industries.
Well, as you know, and I think Clete just used the comment whack-a-mole, China's overcapacity is like a whack-a-mole problem. Not only do they change the nature of the product that then creates a new competitive pressure here, but they're flooding other countries' markets with their core products. You'll remember several years ago, oil country tubular goods, we had a trade case against China. We successfully won that. They then sent hot rolled coil into Korea that was transformed in a minor way. Korea uses no OCTG, but they started shipping it to the U.S. And again, we lost production and employment here in the U.S. That's just one example across hundreds, if not thousands of products. Each trade case takes about a year and a half for the first result and as much as 5 for a final, and costs generally between $1.5 and $3 million. But that doesn't even talk about the injury that's occurred to the company and the workers. Many companies never come back, as you know, and you've seen that in your state. So the tools you've provided in your and Senator Portman's legislation would make it easier to address serial dumping. It would make it easier in a situation like today where companies are just coming back to profitability, but that can be used against them at the ITCs. So I'd say, you know, all of the tools you're providing are ones that U.S. companies and workers need.
Thank you, Mr. Wessel. I remember learning that new acronym and having it burned into my brain, OCTG, as we made those pipes in Ohio. We made them all over the country. And we saw, as Mr. Williams said, the whack-a-mole. They'd go. I remember when they went to Korea, and Korea, who had no industry of that kind, zero before that happened. So thank you. Chair Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, Thanks so much for the hearing, first of all, Ron, for doing this and your ongoing work to address China's anti-competitive trade policies. That, combined with Brown-Wyden and all the things we've done together and will continue to do together, are really important. As this committee moves forward with this bipartisan legislation so American workers and manufacturers can compete, I'd like to ask you, Senator Crapo and Senator Wyden, to work with me and Senator Portman to include our Eliminating Global Market Distortions to Protect American Jobs as part of this effort. We can together strengthen our trade remedy laws, and I will give back time, but ask unanimous consent to include a few letters of support for this legislation in today's record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And thank you, and I yield back the rest of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Brown, and we look forward to working closely with you. Next is Senator Lankford.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. To our witnesses, thank you as well for your work on this exceptionally important issue. I have to tell you, in this day and age, I'm amazed at the number of American companies that are still looking to China to do manufacturing after all the intellectual property that they have stolen, after their immense human rights record and what they have done. And I'm particularly astounded with the number of American companies that will boycott states in the United States or will make public statements about different things, but have no problem doing business in China, who has one of the worst human rights records in the world, who limits free press, who takes away any right to vote for any individual of a meaningful way in China, who does surveillance laws on their people, who violated their word with Hong Kong, who said basically Hong Kong will have some sort of autonomy until 2047. And then when it wasn't convenient, they just broke their word on that and has consumed Hong Kong with their surveillance networks, who does forced abortions on individuals and limits the number of children that families can have, who limits free access to faith, free access to the free press, free access to assembly. All of those things are common in China, not to mention in the prison camps of the Uyghurs and of the multitude of other issues that they've done, as we've talked about economically today. So there are serious issues with any company that's doing business in China. It needs to be clear-eyed on the real risks of having a communist government be your partner for your business. It needs to be very clear for American companies that are going to speak ill of America, but seem to have no problem with engaging in China and the things that the Chinese government does there. So I would encourage companies to be able to be awake as they deal with interaction with China. Saying all that, there are 1 billion people there. There are a lot of companies that want to do business with 1 billion people and are engaged in that process. So I want to be able to talk through some of the things that China is doing that we need to pay attention to. And I'd like to be able to start with rare earth minerals and critical minerals. China's been very strategic and trying to be able to isolate the critical minerals market and rare earth minerals. We have, quite frankly, allowed them by limiting production of critical minerals here in the United States, and have just exported that work to China to be able to manage. Now we are behind the 8 ball in many ways on trying to be able to catch up on those critical minerals that are needed for solar panels, for batteries, for steel production, for so many items in our cell phones, everything else. So let me ask Mr. Williams in this. Do you have ideas on the critical mineral side and things that we can continue to do to be able to catch up and be able to level the playing field that we've abdicated to China?
Thank you, Senator, and I appreciate all of your remarks. I will say on critical minerals, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion in this administration. They have a supply chain executive order where they're looking at this. I think we're all looking forward to the recommendations. One thing I will say, though, if we're serious about this, I really do think that permitting and being able to obtain these minerals in the United States, it's got to be a core part of that. And I understand that some have environmental concerns about that, but we need to figure out a way that we can do it in an environmentally friendly way in the United States, because otherwise I think we are tying our hands behind our back. We can't just subsidize our way out of this. I also would really look at partnerships with other countries. Australia is a country who has done a lot of work in this area, and I think we should use that, look at leveraging institutions like the Development Finance Corporation to have joint partnerships and projects with Australia. So those are 2 ideas that I would put into the mix, and I very much look forward to the results of the Biden administration's review.
Yeah,
Senator,
go ahead.
Senator, if I could just add quickly, the NDAA that Congress passed just, I guess, a veto override earlier this year included a new provision that would expand rare earth mineral utilization by DoD from mines to magnets. Prior to that, the DoD was required to procure products, the final products, from an allied country, essentially, but allowed Chinese rare earth minerals to be able to be the underlying basis. The new provision should help get those 4 U.S.-based mines back online. It's going to take a bit of time, but we need to do that with investments as well as broader provisions.
Would completely agree. Mr. Williams, I want to follow up on a WTO question with you as well. China talks about how they're co-equal to the United States and they're another world superpower until it comes to WTO, and then suddenly they shrink back and say, we're a developing poor country and we need extra subsidies and we don't need to pay our fair share in. What reforms need to be done to WTO? Because China has an outsized influence in that and a veto in any of this dialogue.
There are a lot of reforms that need to be done at the WTO. I have a paper that I wrote on this. I'd love to share that with you and talk through it with you. I know we're almost out of time, but I will say to your point, the developing country status issue is right at the top of the list. If China claims that it is a co-equal partner in the global community with the United States, it needs to treat itself like one at the WTO. And we need to have objective criteria that says, given the significant size and power of their economy, they got to take on every single commitment that the United States does. It's not fair to do it otherwise.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank my colleague, and at this point, it's Senator Casey, and we're just going to keep going. It's been a challenge, but Senator Crapo and I just are determined to make sure that everybody has a chance to get heard on this crucially important topic. Senator Casey.
Mr. Chairman, thanks very much. I know we're well into the vote, so I'll try to be brief and try to be under time. Mr. Wessel, I'll direct my question to you, maybe 2 questions at the most. We've all seen too clearly the cost of relying on China, which is a non-market economy, for our nation's critical capabilities, especially with respect to personal protective equipment. We also have very little visibility on what other vulnerabilities might exist with respect to production dependencies in other sectors of our economy. Last month, the U.S. China Commission held a hearing to examine how U.S. capital investment in China props up the Chinese government's military-civil fusion and ultimately compromises U.S. national security. Some witnesses noted that the U.S. does not have a mechanism to assess how outsourcing by U.S. companies to countries of concern may compromise our national security and the security of supply chains that Americans depend upon. Senators Cornyn, Stabenow, and I have a proposal to increase visibility on vulnerable supply chains to review outbound investment of critical capabilities to foreign adversaries in non-market economies like China to assess and address dependencies and vulnerabilities of our critical supply chains. Mr. Wessel, do you agree the U.S. should establish outbound investment review?
I do, and I think the structure that you have been advancing, I've talked to your staff, allows for the flexibility in terms of viewing this, but will gain the necessary information as well as control where critical products are at risk.
Well, thanks very much. I'll propose, or propound, I should say, additional questions to you in writing. And I'll conclude with this, Mr. Chairman, in the interest of time. I know that Ranking Member Crapo and his staff have raised concerns with respect to elements of this proposal. I think it's important the U.S. has visibility on vulnerable supply chains, and also critical that we know when national critical capabilities are being offshored for foreign adversaries. I hope we can work together to reach a resolution on your concerns. I think all 2 minutes and 30 seconds because I know the vote's on. Thanks very much.
This is Senator Crapo. I believe Senator Wyden has stepped out to go to the vote. So I'm going to go next to Senator Daines.
Yeah. Thanks, Senator Crapo. I spent over half a decade in China in the private sector. We were launching, marketing, selling American brands to compete against back in the 90s against state-owned enterprise brands. And we beat them handily, by the way. It was nice to see American brands winning. I've led a lot of Codels to China, getting more U.S. senators engaged to understand what's going on the ground there, to see the innovation ecosystem that they are building in China, and what that means for the United States and the world. I've seen firsthand the challenge and the repression implemented by the Chinese Communist Party, as well as the need to hold China accountable for its unfair trading practices and existing commitments. It's also essential, I believe, the U.S. makes needed investments into research and development. How do we run faster here in America in terms of global competitiveness and beating China into these next generation technologies, as we are truly in a race to be more competitive and be more innovative. And that's why I strongly support Senator Young's Endless Frontier Act. I appreciate his leadership on this issue, which I think will help ensure the U.S. maintains its competitive edge in scientific and technology innovation and supporting high-tech jobs around our country and right there in Montana. And I want to start with a question, Mr. Williams. In your testimony, you highlight the importance of ensuring the U.S. runs faster. I agree with that. As it relates to competing against China, and reference the Endless Frontier Act as a good start, which I agree with. As Congress considers proposals to ensure the U.S. remains a global leader in innovation and technology, how should we target investment to ensure we expand upon the competitive advantages a free market economy provides and not displace it?
It's a great question, Senator, and I do think that is an important theme that I tried to make in my opening, is that the reason the U.S. has been the world's leader for years at innovation is because of our free markets and our market economy, which is different from China. China has been successful in very targeted areas where it has thrown a ton of money and therefore been able to develop innovative technologies. So I think what we don't want to do is to just throw a bunch of money out the door and hope that we beat them. I think we need to interface with the private sector directly and say, where in particular are you going and how can we help you get there? I think some of the things in the Endless Frontiers Act that talk about working with universities are critical. I think tax credits for innovation for our companies is important, in addition to the things that are in that bill. And again, I think we need to, as we're moving forward, we need to not abandon our principles, because they are the source of our strength. And especially, I think, as we're looking at supply chains, we need to not become a closed-off society where we aren't competing and working with others around the world. We need to leverage each other's the things that we bring to the table. And I think 5G and potentially 6G is a good example. We haven't been able to do everything at home in the United States. We have some companies that are involved there, but we're going to need to work with Japan and others. So it's all about sort of positive incentives at home, and then realizing we can't do everything ourselves, and then where we can maximize our ability to have our companies work with others, work with universities.
Yeah, Mr. I want to thank you. I want to jump into a specific, that's polysilicon. It's a critical component to producing everything: semiconductors, next generation batteries, other technologies essential for long-term competitiveness and growing our economy. And for years, the U.S. polysilicon industry has been targeted by China, and retaliatory tariffs are actually threatening a lot of our high-wage manufacturing jobs in places like REC Silicon in Butte, Montana. What can be done to strengthen the U.S. semiconductor and battery supply chain and reduce our dependence on China for these critically important materials?
Well, I do think that we need to fully fund the Chips for America Act, which was included as part of the NDAA last year. We authorized the program. Let's fund that program. I would also look at the tax incentives that were included there that I think were left on the cutting room floor, that would help for additional fabrication in the United States. We also need to keep helping additional design in the United States. And then the other thing on semiconductors is we need to, if we are going to take export control measures against China, we need to coordinate those with others. And we need to let our semiconductors companies sell non-sensitive materials to China. Because ultimately what that does is that makes China subsidize our companies. So look, on the most sensitive stuff, you may have to shut the door, but on stuff that isn't sensitive, let's let our companies sell overseas. So we put China in the position of helping us subsidize.
With a few seconds left here, if you had a quick comment on, I'm concerned about critical minerals in China's control there. What risk does the U.S. face should China restrict access to these critical minerals, and how can we mitigate the threat? I know I'm out of time, so you have to make a quick answer.
Sure, they've done it before, and we sued them at the WTO and won. When they tried to do that, I think we need to keep disciplines there internationally, but we also need to partner with others to diversify our supply chains and our source of supply. And I mentioned in an earlier question, Australia would be a great partner on some of those things. I'd also look at Canada and others who have some resources.
As well as our own. Thank you, Clete.
Just very quickly on polysilicon, we should act against the forced labor that's producing the polysilicon in the Xinjiang region. It's something that's been raised, and that could have a big impact as well.
Thanks, Mr. Wessel. Thanks, Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much, Senator Daines. And I'm not sure if we have any senators back from the votes yet, so I'm going to go through a few names here. And if none of the senators are back yet, I have a couple of questions of my own that I didn't get to ask before. Is Senator Warner available? Senator Young? Senator Whitehouse? Senator Sass? Senator Hassan? Senator Barrasso? Senator Cortez Masto? I believe she is, I've been told she is close to.
I am here. Thank you
so
much.
Good.
Wonderful.
Catherine, go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member. So this is a great conversation, and I so appreciate the written testimonies. Let me start with a panel on technology competition. It's clear that competing with China in the technology sector will entail a whole of government response. And that's why I've been working on legislation to conduct a review every 4 years that will collect, coordinate, and outline the national posture on key technology issues. I think by clearly identifying our goals and appropriately investing, we can ensure the United States is globally competitive for decades to come. But my question is, what role do you see technology development and innovation playing in the broader global competition landscape? And what would you agree that it would be helpful to have a strategic posture across many federal agencies to be competitive on various technologies such as 5G, AI, and green energy? And let me open that up and maybe start with Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Senator. And I think it is a good idea for us to be more strategic and to coordinate better across the interagency. I think that's an area that we have struggled with a little bit in recent years. And I think making sure we have an overall strategic viewpoint is important. I also like the idea that you are constantly updating priorities and you're constantly reviewing it. And I do think this is where the point I was making earlier, we're having the private sector come in and help us understand where they're going and where they need help is the way to do it. We don't want a completely top-down approach where the U.S. government just decides we're going to do X and throw subsidies out the door. There needs to be this constant feedback loop with our industry so we know exactly what they need. And so I would make sure that you bake that in there as well.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any other comments on this question?
I would just say that I think it's spot on. If we look at what's happening now in the auto sector being starved for semiconductor, and it's resulted in production and employment loss, technology is now embedded in virtually all of our products, production processes, and the products themselves. So it's no longer some esoteric issue. It goes to the core of America's competitiveness.
Thank you. And Dr. Kokos, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah. Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. So I think that a national posture on tech issues is essential in my conversations with our partners and allies in Japan, the European Union, and Australia. One of their major critiques is that it's very difficult to collaborate with the United States because there isn't a clear affirmative vision for what U.S. tech policy actually is. The second issue that I would point out is the importance of having aligned tech policy across different agencies for cybersecurity purposes. So agencies like the Social Security Administration have not historically had a large cybersecurity mandate. However, they have increasingly sensitive data that could be very useful in targeted hacks. And finally, I think that it's particularly important to look at a national policy in order to be able to deal with Chinese acquisitions of global firms that gather data within the United States. So currently, the CFIUS process doesn't address that. So I'm thinking specifically of Syngenta and it's as the largest Chinese acquisition outside of the U.S. They gather huge amounts of U.S. agricultural data, but it was an acquisition of a Swiss firm. So by having a strong U.S. tech policy, we can actually identify which types of data and which particular sectors are most important to address nationally, and manage issues like that that aren't currently addressed in things like the CFIUS process. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I so appreciate that. Another area I want to focus on with all of you while we're here is the technology standards. One key area we address as we look at global competitiveness is really over new technology is the standards setting process, right? Standard specifications define performance requirements for materials, products, and services related to technologies around the world. I believe it is critical that we absolutely look at this for our emerging technologies. The Chinese government has already established goals to set global standards for emerging technologies like 5G and 6G, the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence. And again, I'm working on legislation to establish this interagency task force that will develop really a strategy for emerging technology standard setting to help us affirm our leadership on this issue. So I wondered if you'd be willing to discuss the importance of the U.S. involvement in standard setting and how critical it is at this point in time.
So one thing that...
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. Very briefly, one thing that I think has received a lack of attention is the participation of Chinese government entities in multi-stakeholder organizations. And we've discussed a lot about multilateral considerations, and I think that is crucially important. However, these are things that could immediately change on a dime. And when bringing this up to colleagues in the Department of Commerce, one of the things that they've highlighted is that this is a U.S. policy decision. And I think that we're really leaving things on the table by allowing Chinese regulators to participate actively in multi-stakeholder organizations and professional organizations that are really setting the standards based upon how the U.S. has structured this, or how the U.S. has structured the global regulatory environment by putting corporate interests first. However, U.S. corporations currently have multiple different masters, shall we say, and are interested in both their relationship with the Chinese government and the U.S. government. By not sending U.S. government entities to these professional organizations, we are enabling the Chinese government to take leadership in crucial areas. I'm thinking particularly in facial recognition technologies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I know my time is up. Thank you for this great discussion today.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. And I'm going to check again. I understand several senators are on their way back. Are there any senators who have not had a chance to ask questions who are?
Senator Warner.
Senator Warner, you're up.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, Mr. Almost Chairman. Let me build. I'm not going to ask a question on this, but I want to echo what Senator Cortez Masto just asked and Dr. Kokas's comments. I mean, this is an area where, candidly, I think America went to sleep. We spent, we lived for 50 years assuming that on almost every technological innovation, even if we didn't invent it in America, that we would set the standards, the rules, the protocols, the procedures. And, I see this in 5G. I was a telecom guy. We didn't flood the zone with our engineers and our technical people. China is flooding the zone and consequently setting standards. You mentioned facial recognition. I'm fearful that that's going to grow into AI across the board. We've already seen China set standards on 5G, and the standards are so important because it's not just about what radio spectrum you use or what technical specs. It really does creep into things like transparency, like respect for human rights. It's just, I think it is so important. And, if you look, China's even got a document, China 2035, where they have laid out by issue area where they hope to set the standards. So, Dr. Kokas, I want to, a corollary of that is where U.S. companies are actually almost enabling, under the guise that nobody can miss the Chinese market. They are willing to sacrifice their values that they'd never sacrifice in our country, or for that matter, in virtually any other Western country, to kind of get access to this market. I actually think sometimes helping China with censorship, surveillance, social control. A couple years ago, I wrote the Google CEO with Chairman Wyden about the company's efforts to literally work with the Chinese government to build a surveillance-enabled search engine in China. Totally counter to anything Google has said about their values. How do we address this entity where actual American companies are willing and obliging Chinese efforts to advance not only their economic dominance, but the goals of the CCP? And when I mention China, I think it's always important to mention my beef is with the CCP and Xi Jinping, and it's not with the Chinese people or the Chinese diaspora, particularly Chinese Americans. But how do we hold U.S. companies accountable to the kind of values they espouse here when they then quietly are willing to work to advance the goals of the CCP in terms of their surveillance state?
So thank you so much, Senator Warner, and it's a pleasure to answer this question as a proud professor at University of Virginia and a proud Virginian. So I think that this is a multi-pronged question, and there isn't one specific answer. One area where I think that the U.S. can make a huge difference is by passing a comprehensive data privacy framework, which prevents U.S. companies from exfiltrating data to China, or Chinese companies that are operating within the U.S. from exfiltrating data back to China. I think this is essential because it also strengthens consumer privacy within the U.S. It also is truly important because we have a situation in the U.S. where companies are, we've used the word whack-a-mole multiple times, but companies are changing their privacy policies by the day. As I write about these things, I have to have alerts for when TikTok is changing their transparency policy. The legislative calendar does not work at that pace. So there needs to be legislation, and there needs to be reporting in place for how companies are sharing their data abroad. That's something that we can do within the U.S. This is also important because we don't know precisely the ownership stakes or the ownership relationships of privately held companies that have relationships with China. I'm thinking particularly of Epic Games and Fortnite, gathering huge amounts of data, and we have no idea how they're sharing it. All that we have reliance on is what the company says, and they say that they don't share their data with their Chinese partners, but there's really no way that I have identified that we can actually test that. So I think that's an important first step.
I appreciate that, and I do appreciate the work you've done, and proud that you're doing it at University of Virginia. I just, in my last 25 seconds, want to just make the case not only to the panel, and Mr. Wessel's actually helped on some of this. I believe the Chinese model, which I call kind of authoritarianism capitalism, where they allowed dramatic domestic competition in emerging technologies, always then giving a Chinese champion that emerges dominance in the Chinese market, and then that Chinese champion is advanced abroad. We've seen in the case of Huawei, $100 billion backstop. We see it in the case of semiconductors, $150 billion investment. Many of us on this committee are working in a bipartisan way to make a substantial investment in the semiconductor industry, $50 billion in an emergency appropriation under the so-called CHIPS Act with my good friend John. Many on the committee. We need to make that law very shortly. We also need, in an area, I would argue, where we have we're not only behind because we don't even have an American player, but we could potentially lose the game in 5G. We need to move beyond 5G to called ORAN, Open Radio Access Network. We've got a similar type of emergency appropriation that is broadly endorsed by American and other companies about moving to this more software-based system in ORAN. And I've gone too long, so the pitch here is to my colleagues. I'd love to talk to you more individually. I think this legislation will be up the second week of May, and I think sending a broad bipartisan signal that America is willing to get back in the game in terms of these cutting-edge technologies, standard setting, and also the key research is critically important. And with that, I don't have any time to yield back, Mr. Chairman or Mr. Senator Crapo, but thanks for giving me the extra minute.
You bet. Thank you. And I appreciate your focus there. I support what you're saying. Next is Senator Young.
And Senator Young's been a leader on this. Let me just, as he comes on, give him the shout out as well. He's been the key leader on the underlying legislation.
Yep, he's been very strong on this. I'm going to go through a few more names. Senator Whitehouse, Senator Sass, Senator Barrasso, Senator Warren, Senator Scott. We do expect a couple of those back right away. And so while we're waiting for them, I have a question for you, Mr. Williams. It's on the TRIPS agreement. When you were in the Trump administration, you were part of the team that worked to stop forced technology transfers to China. Some have argued that the TRIPS intellectual property waiver would amount to exactly that, a forced transfer of mRNA vaccine technology to China and other countries, and would be delivering a competitive advantage to countries that are increasingly viewed as our adversaries at taxpayer expense. Do you agree, and how do you evaluate this?
Thank you, Senator. Unfortunately, I do agree, and I am very concerned about the Biden administration's consideration of a waiver of intellectual property protections at the WTO, which ostensibly would help distribute more vaccines for COVID around the world. Now, look, I will be the first to say the more we can do to distribute vaccines around the world and help other people is great. But the problem is this is absolutely not the right way to do it. IP has not been an impediment to vaccine distribution. And we've actually had our companies do licensing agreements with companies in India. So the notion that IP is somehow causing a problem here is wrong. And it really, I think, is just this longstanding effort by India and others to undermine US IP at the WTO. And then to the specific point you made, let's keep in mind that the technology that we're talking about, the mRNA technology, this was something that was funded by DARPA, by our Department of Defense as a national priority that helped facilitate the production of these vaccines. And the notion that we would go to the WTO and basically say, technology transfer of DARPA-funded research to China, which has specifically identified this in its Made in China 2025 plan, the fact that we would basically aid and abet Made in China 2025 is crazy to me. And so I really hope the administration realizes that this isn't the right way forward. I think there are other solutions they can look at. I think, funding distribution is fine. Facilitating licensing agreements that are done on voluntary terms is fine. And I think if we're having an honest conversation about this, we also need to look at our export policies and say, how do we export more of this stuff from the United States? And I know a lot of senators here, are interested in building a stronger domestic biopharmaceutical sector. So let's use this as an example. Let's help them send these vaccines around the world and strengthen our supply chain in America.
Thank you. Do any of the other witnesses have an opinion on this issue that you'd like to share?
Hey, Senator, thank you for the question. And, I've looked hard at this. I disagree with Clete's comments on a very limited waiver for this product. I think we're facing such a large problem globally that we have to bring this into line, but we also need to do better about the preventive measures, the ability to make sure our early warning systems are better, et cetera. But I would do this as a one-off, but restricted to this product.
Senator Crapo?
Yes.
Just 2 quick points on this. So first of all, I would like to agree with Mr. Kessel that if we aren't able to actually bring the COVID-19 pandemic under control, there won't actually be a global economy or efficient global trade for us to be able to discuss. So I think there is a reason for a very limited exception here. But the other thing that I think is really important to underscore that seems to be the focus of this committee hearing is that the mRNA vaccine technology emerged from the funding of basic research in the United States. And advancing the funding of basic research, not strictly applied research, but basic research is essential in order to ensure American competitiveness. We don't know how long, it's a very long time horizon, so there tends to be a focus on strictly applied technologies. But this underscores the importance of not just funding things that we can use within the next year or 2 years, but things that build out our innovation ecosystem for the next 20, 30, 40 years. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Senator, if you'll indulge me for just 20 seconds, I would like to say I've agreed with Mr. Wessel on so many things, but I think it's important to note that the proposal that India and others are making at the WTO is not limited. they're basically asking to waive broad portions of this intellectual property agreement, ostensibly because of this vaccine issue, but really it's a much broader proposal. And I think there are just better ways to do it. We don't need to give our technology up to China and others. I think we can facilitate exports from the United States.
Yeah, again, I would do it as a one-off. I understand the concerns and share them because IP really goes to the heart of America's competitiveness.
All right. Thank you. Thank you both very much. Have we had, well, for example, I'm told Senator Young is coming back. Senator Young, are you back yet? Any other senators who have made it back yet? All right, I'm going to go on with another question then. And this one is to you, Mr. Baer. One of the issues with the Section 301 exclusion process that I've seen in terms of companies coming to me and asking for help in trying to get a 301 exclusion is timeliness. It takes a significant amount of time to get the 301 exclusion through the process and put into place. And now to have them expire and have to go through that process again, I would think is a little disconcerting. Would it be helpful to businesses like yours, and as we talked earlier, issues across our country in this context, if there were some kind of a timeline or a time frame required for responsiveness to these kinds of issues?
Yeah, most certainly. I certainly understand that government operates differently than business, and for probably very good reasons. But certainly, the length of time that some of these things have taken have been a challenge for us, right? I mean, we're almost to May now, and we're still trying to fight getting our exclusions back. So certainly some better timeliness, or at least expectation of timeframes, would be helpful.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to weigh in on the Section 301 exclusion process or issues?
Sure, Senator. I would just say I do think that this administration should reinstate a process as soon as possible. We want to help out companies like Mr. Baer's, and I think that if we want to make I think there's some changes we might want to make to it as well to make sure it's more transparent and actually works for companies, and that they have some sense of certainty there. So I would strongly support what he just said.
All right, thank you very much. I still don't see any senators having made it back yet. Are there any? Okay, I'm going to go on to another question then, and this is just one that I'd like to throw out generally. It's with regard to semiconductors. Senator Wyden and I, and many of the others on this committee, and other senators in the Senate, are very committed to strengthening and improving America's competitiveness in the semiconductor industry. In response to Chinese anti-competitive conduct and subsidization, as well as activities across the globe in other countries. One of the big things that has already been discussed about that is the CHIPS Act, somewhere between $30 and $50 billion of direct grant support for American semiconductor industries. That's primarily a spending issue. It would really be resolved most likely in one of the spending bills that's moving on the Senate floor or in the appropriations process. But we've been looking very carefully at, within the jurisdiction of the Finance Committee, what types of activities or solutions would be helpful. For example, a tax credit, a development tax credit, or an R&D tax credit, or some other type of ability to incentivize the growth and the strengthening of our semiconductor industry. I'd just like some of you who may have thoughts on this to kind of freewheel with me here for a second and discuss what could we do to go beyond the CHIPS Act to do what's necessary to strengthen our semiconductor industry. Anybody?
Senator, I'll take a crack at that if I can, and thank you for the great question. And certainly, the CHIPS Act being fully funded is the first step. But this committee has significant jurisdiction. So first of all, for example, in trade agreements, the ability to include these kind of technology products as part of content requirements. Often it's done more generally, and there are things that can be done, as was done in part in USMCA, to look at new technologies and how we can use procurement as a pull-through. That's number one. Number two, there's often what's called a valley of death between research and deployment. And I think the committee could look more at how we expand the deployment of these technologies without running afoul of WTO subsidy protocols and disciplines. The ability to test the development and deployment of technologies. These chip fabs, as you know, as well as the equipment used to produce semiconductors, is extremely expensive. So taking something from the lab bench to the shop floor, the clean room floor, is a difficult process. I think that's something where there are a lot of tax rules and other provisions under the jurisdiction of finance that could come into play.
And Senator, I would just add, I mean, I do think that, as you alluded to, some of these tax credits that are within your jurisdiction are the way to go. And in particular, I mean, if you look at the semiconductor supply chain, you know, there are some things we're doing well, and there's some things we haven't done as well in recent years. And you really need to look at the foundries and fabrication of semiconductors and finding ways to actually manufacture it in the United States. But I also will make a broader point here, which is, in addition to sort of specific targeted things for the industry, we also need to look at the general conditions of doing business in the United States. And that gets to overall tax policy, that gets to overall how easy is it to make new facilities, to site new facilities in the United States. And it also looks at how well can you export from America. And as I alluded to before, when we're looking at export control measures, we need to be careful that they don't make it too difficult for us to send our product abroad. And we need trade agreements so we have new markets for ourselves as well. So I think all those things are important.
Thank you. Anybody else? All right, I'm going to ask again if any of our senators have made it back. For our witnesses, we have 4 votes going on right now. And I'm guessing that a lot of our senators are just feeling like they're caught up on the floor until they can get through this. Oh, here's Senator Wyden. We can ask him how to proceed. Senator, can you hear me?
I can.
We don't have any other senators back and haven't had anybody back for probably 5 or 10 minutes. And I've run out of my questions. And so I don't know whether you want to wrap up the hearing or whether you expect other senators to come back, but the ball is returned to you.
Okay. They gave him last call. Senator Crapo, and let's make sure we ask staff about it. My understanding is on both sides, our side and your side, we gave a last call for senators who would like to participate. So let's check. Your side does not have any additional.
Yeah, my understanding, we are not aware of anybody on our side who is asking to participate at this point. Am I right?
Let me just check with our side. That's nobody's waiting either. Nobody's waiting. Well, what I'll do is, and I welcome you two as well, Senator Crapo, if you would like to. I'm just going to give a short closing statement, and that also will give us a chance to see if members come back. And I want to thank our witnesses, terrific panel, because
Senator Wyden, I have to, they're calling me because I got to get back to this next vote. So I'm going to slip out now. You can wrap it up.
Perfect. Thank you, Senator Crapo. I want to thank our witnesses, and let's make sure. I'm sorry. Okay, very good. I want to thank our witnesses because you gave us exactly the kind of information we need to get to the bottom line, which is to outcompete China. And my colleagues today have raised a variety of critical issues with respect to our trading relationship, digital trade, censorship, agriculture, theft of intellectual property, monetary policy. The list goes on. And to me, this diversity of topics shows that this is a substantial, difficult, and multi-pronged issue that China presents. I appreciated Mr. Wessel describing the size of the problem, $2.4 trillion in lost intellectual property, $134 billion trade deficit in advanced technology, an estimated 3.7 million lost jobs since 2001. Dr. Kokis described China's efforts to export repression. That's how I would characterize it. And we always think about exports. What they're doing is exporting repression through their digital and censorship policies. Mr. Williams and Mr. Baer captured the impact of these anti-competitive practices in the United States. So we look forward to working with all of you on a clear-eyed and effective legislative response to these anti-competitive practices. And my view is this legislation and the bipartisan approach we're pursuing is an example of trade done right, because it says at the center, we're going to make sure that American workers have a chance to compete fairly. Now, I believe Senator Stabenow of Michigan, for whom these China issues are very important to her, is on her way to the hearing. So I think at this point, we'll take, with your leave, we'll take a 5-minute recess and we'll wait for Senator Stabenow because these are important issues to her, and we'll be back at you. And at the conclusion of her questions, we'll wrap up. So my thanks to all of you.